Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Before you hit play, I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is not fiction. These are 6 real encounters from November in the Appalachian wilderness. Real people, real terror, and some of them never made it back the same. Something wakes up in those mountains when November comes, something that's been waiting, watching, learning how to become you. So right now, subscribe if you want more stories like this, hit like, and share this with someone brave enough to listen. Comment where you're from. I want to know who's still awake after this. Turn off your lights, put on your headphones. Because once you hear story number 3, you'll understand why some places should stay empty in November. Let's begin. I'm 41 years old, and I drive long-haul trucks for a living. Been doing it for almost 20 years now, which means I've seen a lot of weird stuff on back roads at 3 a.m., but nothing prepared me for what happened to my family and me in November of 2019. My name's Steve Walsh, and I live outside Charleston with my wife Karen and our twin boys, Jake and Luke. They were 12 at the time, 7th graders who spent every free moment glued to their phones or gaming systems. Karen works at First National Bank downtown, and between her schedule and mine, being on the road 3 weeks out of every month, we hardly saw each other, let alone had any real family time. That's why Karen suggested the camping trip in the first place. She'd been researching family activities online during her lunch breaks, trying to find something that would get us all together without screens for a few days. The boys had a long weekend coming up in November because of some teacher conference thing, and Karen found this campground up near Seneca Rocks that had perfect reviews. Remote enough to really unplug, one review said, but safe and well-maintained for families. The pictures showed these neat little campsites tucked back in the woods, each one private but not too isolated. Perfect for what we wanted. I'll be honest, I wasn't thrilled about camping in November. West Virginia gets cold that time of year, and I spend enough nights sleeping in my truck cab to know I prefer a real bed when I'm home. But Karen was excited about it, and the boys actually seemed interested when we showed them the hiking trails and the rock formations you could see from the campground. Jake's always been the outdoorsy one of the twins, and Luke usually follows whatever Jake wants to do. When Jake said it looked actually pretty cool, I knew we had a winner. We loaded up my personal truck, a Ford F-150 that I keep for family stuff, with our camping gear that Friday afternoon. Karen had made lists of everything we'd need: tent, sleeping bags, camp stove, coolers full of food, first aid kit, flashlights, the works. She'd even bought special camping chairs that folded up tiny and weighed nothing. The boys packed their backpacks with extra clothes and, despite the no technology rule we'd established, I caught them trying to sneak their portable chargers. I confiscated those but let them keep their phones for emergencies, which turned out to be a good thing later. The drive up took about 3 hours, winding through smaller and smaller roads until we finally turned onto this gravel path, marked by a simple wooden sign that said, Peaceful Pines Family Campground. The road went back into the woods for maybe half a mile, before opening up into a clearing with a small office building and about 15 campsites scattered around. Each site had a picnic table, a fire ring, and a level spot for tents. There were vault toilets and a hand-pump well for water. Simple, clean, exactly what the reviews had promised. We were the only family there, which the camp host explained was normal for November. Most folks come in summer and fall, he said. An older guy named Earl, with weathered hands and a friendly smile. You picked a good weekend though, supposed to stay clear and not too cold. He helped us pick out a site toward the back that had good tree cover and was close to the trailhead for the hiking trail we wanted to do. Site number 12, I remember, because Jake made some joke about it being their age. Setting up camp went smoother than I'd expected. The boys actually helped, instead of complaining. And Karen had everything organized so well that we had our tent up, gear sorted, and a fire going before the sun went down. We cooked hot dogs over the fire and made s'mores. And I have to say, it felt good. Really good, like we were actually a family instead of 4 people who happened to live in the same house. The boys told stories about school, Karen and I talked about work without one of us rushing off somewhere, and for the first time in months, everyone seemed relaxed. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, perfect hiking weather. We packed day packs with water, snacks, and warm layers, then headed out on what the trail map called the Overlook Trail, 8 miles round trip to a scenic viewpoint. The trail was well marked and not too difficult, winding up through hardwood forest that still had some late fall color left. Jake and Luke made a competition out of spotting wildlife, which meant we moved pretty slowly but saw more than we would have otherwise. A few deer, some squirrels, lots of birds. Luke found an old stone wall from some long-abandoned homestead, and we spent 20 minutes exploring what was left of the foundation. The overlook was worth the hike. You could see for miles across the mountains, layer after layer of ridges fading into the distance. The boys took pictures with their phones, their first time using them since Friday, and Karen and I just stood there, holding hands, looking out at all that wilderness. "This is what we needed," she said, and I agreed. For those few hours, everything felt right with the world. We started back down around 4 p.m., taking our time and enjoying the afternoon light filtering through the trees. The boys had burned off their extra energy on the way up, so they were quieter now, just walking and occasionally pointing out things they'd missed on the way to the overlook. Good tired, you know? The kind of tired you get from actually doing something instead of just being worn down by stress and routine. As we got closer to the campground, I could see our sight through the trees. The fire we'd banked that morning was still smoldering, sending up a thin line of smoke, and everything looked exactly like we'd left it, normal, peaceful. But as we walked into the campsite clearing, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was another family sitting at our picnic table. At first, I thought maybe we'd gotten confused about which site was ours, but no, there was our blue tent, our cooler, our camping chairs arranged around the fire ring exactly where we'd left them. But sitting at our table was a family of 4 that looked exactly like us, same ages, same builds, wearing the exact same clothes we'd put on that morning. The man looked like me, down to the faded Carhartt jacket and work boots. The woman looked like Karen, same blonde hair, pulled back in a ponytail, same red fleece jacket. And there were 2 boys who looked exactly like Jake and Luke, but something was wrong with their faces. The smiles were too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a way that human faces just don't work. Their eyes were the right color but somehow flat, like looking at painted glass instead of something alive. And they all moved at exactly the same time, turning their heads toward us in perfect synchronization when they noticed us standing there. "Oh, look," the fake Karen said, her voice sounding exactly like my wife's but with the words coming out slightly wrong, like someone reading a script in a language they didn't quite understand. "The imposters have returned to our campsite." "Our campsite," the fake Steve, the thing wearing my face agreed, nodding. "We have been here all weekend, enjoying our family camping trip." The fake boys just stared at us with those 2 wide grins and empty eyes. One of them, I couldn't tell which one was supposed to be Jake and which was supposed to be Luke, spoke up. "We went hiking today to the scenic overlook. It was 8 miles round trip through beautiful fall foliage." The words were right, but the way he said them was like he was reading from a nature brochure. No 12-year-old talks like that. Karen grabbed my arm. "Steve," she whispered. "What?" "I don't know," I said, keeping my voice low. My heart was starting to pound, that fight-or-flight response kicking in hard. "Boys, stay close to us." But when I looked around for Jake and Luke, they were just standing there, staring at their doubles with fascination instead of fear. "Dad," Jake said slowly, "why do they look like us?" The fake family heard him and all turned their heads toward Jake in that same creepy synchronization. "We are the Walsh family," the fake Karen said. "We have been camping here for our annual November family bonding trip." That's when I noticed their clothes weren't quite right. From a distance, they'd looked exactly like what we were wearing, but up close, I could see the fabric was wrong. It looked almost like skin, with a texture that seemed to shift and crawl when you looked directly at it. And their movements, now that I was really watching, were too fluid. Like they had extra joints, or their bones bent in directions that human bones don't go. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is our campsite, Site 12. We've been here since yesterday." All 4 of the fake family members tilted their heads to the left at exactly the same angle. "Site 12 belongs to the Walsh family," the fake Steve said. "We can prove this because we know many things about the Walsh family life." "Karen works at First National Bank as a teller," one of the fake boys said. She has worked there for 6 years and enjoys helping customers with their banking needs. Steve drives trucks for long-haul delivery, the other fake boy added. He has been away from home for 3 weeks and returned on Thursday to spend quality time with his family. That stopped me cold. Those facts were right, but we'd never told anyone here our personal business. Earl, the camp host, might have known our names from the registration, but not where we worked or how long I'd been on the road. Jake and Luke are twins in 7th grade, fake Karen continued. They enjoy video games and spend too much time on their phones instead of engaging in family activities. Which is why we planned this camping trip, fake Steve finished. To reconnect as a family unit without the distractions of modern technology. The real Jake moved closer to me. Dad, how do they know all that? I didn't have an answer. The fake family was still staring at us with those horrible wide smiles, and I was starting to notice other things wrong with them. Their skin was too smooth, like plastic, and when they breathed, their chests moved too much, like they were working harder than they should to get air. And their eyes never blinked. You folks need to find your own campsite, I said, trying to sound authoritative. This one's taken. All 4 of them stood up at the same time, moving in that too fluid way. We are the Walsh family, they said in unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. You are the imposters who must leave. That's when I realized we were in serious trouble. Not just confusion or some weird coincidence, real danger. These things, whatever they were, weren't human. They were wearing our faces, claiming our identities, and they seemed to know details about our lives that they shouldn't know. Karen, I said quietly, get the boys and head toward the truck. But when I looked around, I realized something else that made my blood run cold. The campground was completely empty. Earl's office was dark. No other cars in any of the other sites. No signs of life anywhere. When we'd left that morning, there had been at least one other family, an older couple in an RV at site number 4. Now, there was nothing. Where is everyone? Luke asked, his voice small and scared. The fake family heard him, and their grins somehow got even wider, stretching their faces in ways that should have torn skin. There is no one else, fake Karen said. There has never been anyone else. Only the Walsh family at Site 12. I pulled out to my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Not even one bar, which was weird because I'd had full signal that morning when the boys took pictures at the overlook. Karen checked her phone too, shaking her head. The truck? I said. Everyone to the truck, now. We started backing away from the picnic table, keeping our eyes on the fake family. They didn't follow us, just stood there, swaying slightly, like trees in a wind we couldn't feel. But as we got closer to where I'd parked the F-150, I could see something wrong with it too. The tires were flat, all 4 of them, completely flat, like someone had let all the air out. But more than that, when I got close enough to look inside, I could see that the interior was wrong. The seats were the right color, but the fabric looked like that same skin texture material the fake family's clothes were made of. And there were too many mirrors, not just the rear view and side mirrors, but mirrors covering every surface inside the cab. What the hell is happening? Karen whispered. I tried the door handle anyway, and it opened normally. The keys were where I'd left them in the cup holder. But when I turned the ignition, nothing happened. No sound, no lights on the dashboard, nothing. The truck was completely dead. Behind us, the fake family started laughing. Not normal laughter, but this sound like wind blowing through a cave, hollow and echoing. When I turned around, they were still standing by the picnic table. But now I could see them more clearly in the late afternoon light. Their skin was rippling, like water or like there was something moving underneath it. The fake Steve's face stretched and contracted, the features shifting just slightly each time. Same with fake Karen and the fake boys. They were becoming more like us with each passing second, but in doing so, they were also becoming less human. Dad, Jake said, grabbing my arm. Look at their shadows. I looked down at the ground around the fake family. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows from the trees and the picnic table, but the fake family had no shadows at all, just empty ground where their shadows should have been. We need to get out of here, I said, walking if we have to. But as we started toward the campground entrance, the fake family finally moved. They flowed across the ground like smoke, too fast and too smooth, and suddenly they were standing in front of us, blocking the path. You cannot leave, Fake, Steve said, his voice now sounding exactly like mine. You must stay so we can complete our study. Study of what? Karen demanded, her voice shaking. Of how to be you, Fake Karen answered. We have been watching the Walsh family for many weeks, learning your patterns, your voices, your relationships. Soon, we will know everything we need to know. One of the fake boys stepped forward. We will return to your home and live your lives better than you lived them. Your neighbors will not know the difference. Your employers will not know the difference. No one will know the difference. What about us? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The fake family's grins returned, wider than ever. You will not be needed, they said in unison. That's when I noticed the cave. Behind our campsite, back where the woods got thick, there was an opening in the hillside I hadn't seen before. It looked like a natural cave mouth, maybe 6 feet wide and tall enough for a person to walk through. But what caught my attention were the things scattered around the entrance. Camping gear, lots of it. Tents and sleeping bags and coolers in various stages of decay, like they'd been there for years. Some of the newer stuff looked familiar. I could swear I saw an RV awning that matched the one that older couple had been using. How many families? I asked. Many, Fake Steve answered. This is a good hunting ground. Families come here to connect and unplug from technology. They are isolated, far from help, perfect for study. The fake boys started walking toward us again, and I could see now that their movements were completely wrong. Their joints bent backward, their arms were too long, and when they walked, their feet didn't quite touch the ground. Run, I told my family. Into the woods, now. We scattered, crashing through the underbrush toward the tree line. Behind us, I could hear the fake family making that wind through cave sound again. But now it was angry, frustrated. I could hear them moving through the forest, but not like humans would move. More like water flowing around obstacles, or like they were sliding between the trees instead of walking around them. Jake and Luke were faster than Karen and me, disappearing ahead into the darkening woods. I could hear them calling back to us, trying to stay together, but the sound echoed strangely off the trees. Some of the voices sounded right, but others had that same wrong quality as the fake family's speech. Steve. I heard Karen call from somewhere to my left. Steve, help me. But when I turned toward the voice, I saw fake Karen standing between 2 oak trees, her skin now rippling constantly like water. Steve, she called again in my wife's voice. I'm hurt. I need you. I didn't answer. Instead, I kept moving deeper into the woods, following what I hoped was the real Karen's voice. Behind me, fake Karen's voice changed, becoming angry and frustrated. You cannot run from us, it called. We know all your voices now. We know all your words. Then I heard my own voice coming from another direction. Karen, boys, over here, I found the trail. But I hadn't said that. I was standing perfectly still, listening to something, wearing my face call to my family in my own voice. The woods around me filled with voices. Karen calling for the boys calling for us. My voice giving directions, reassuring everyone, trying to lead them back toward the campground. But none of the voices were coming from the right directions, and some of them said things that were just slightly wrong. Jake, Luke, come toward Daddy's voice. That sounded like Karen, but she never called me Daddy when talking to the boys. Mom, we're lost. That sounded like Luke, but he was using words and a tone that sounded more like Jake. Everyone head back to our vehicle for safety. That was definitely my voice, but I would never call my truck a vehicle in casual conversation. I realized what they were doing. The fake family was using our voices to split us up, to separate us so they could pick us off one by one. They'd been studying us, learning how we talked and acted, but they didn't understand the subtle differences that only we would know. Karen, I called out, using the pet name I'd given her when we were dating. Puddin', where are you? A pause, then her real voice answered, Over here, Stevie. Using the name she only called me when we were alone. I followed her voice and found her crouched behind a fallen log with both boys. They all looked terrified but unharmed. Those things, she whispered. They were calling us in your voice, trying to get us to come back. I know, I said. They're not human. I don't know what they are, but they're studying us, learning how to replace us. Replace us how? Jake asked. They're going back to our house, I said. Going to pretend to be us. Live our lives. "What happens to us?" Luke asked, his voice very small. I didn't answer that. I couldn't. "We need to get out of these woods," I said instead. "Get to a road, flag down help." "Which way?" Karen asked. I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal, but the GPS was working enough to show our rough location. The campground was behind us, but there was a county road about 2 miles northeast through the forest. If we could make it there, we might find help. We started moving, trying to stay quiet and keep together. The fake voices kept calling to us from different directions, but we ignored them. After a while, they seemed to give up, or maybe they realized we weren't falling for it anymore. The woods got darker as the sun set, but we kept pushing toward where the road should be. Jake had a small flashlight in his backpack, and we used it sparingly, just enough to keep from walking into trees or falling into holes. It took us almost 3 hours to reach the road, and by then we were exhausted, scratched up from pushing through underbrush, and probably mildly hypothermic from the cold. But when we finally stumbled out of the tree line onto the blacktop, it felt like entering a different world. My phone immediately started working again. Full signal, missed messages, everything normal. I called 911 and tried to explain what had happened, but I could tell the dispatcher thought we'd gotten lost camping and let our imaginations run wild. A state trooper picked us up about 20 minutes later and drove us back toward the campground to get our stuff. But when we got there, the place was completely empty. Our campsite was bare, no tent, no gear, nothing. Even the fire ring was cold, like it hadn't been used in years. "You sure this is the right place?" the trooper asked. Earl's office was locked up tight, and according to the trooper, the campground had been closed for the season since October. No camp host, no recent registrations, no record of us ever being there. "But we paid," Karen insisted. "We made a reservation online. When we got home and checked her email, there was no confirmation, no record of any transaction. The campground's website didn't exist. The reviews we'd read had vanished. It's been 6 years now, and we've never been camping again. Hell, we barely go anywhere together as a family that isn't absolutely necessary. The boys are 18 now, getting ready for college, and they still won't sleep with their bedroom doors closed." Karen changed jobs because she couldn't stand the thought of those things knowing where she worked. "I still drive trucks, but I've changed my routes. I won't take loads that go anywhere near Seneca Rocks, and I've started carrying a gun in my cab, though I'm not sure it would do any good against whatever we met in those woods. Sometimes, when I'm on a long haul at 3 a.m., I'll see a family in a car passing the other direction, and for just a second they'll look like us. Same faces, same ages, same tired expressions. Then I blink and they're strangers again. But I always wonder, are those the real families, or are they the things that replace them? And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear voices outside that sound like us having conversations we've never had. Talking about plans we've never made, discussing people we've never met. They get louder around November, especially near the anniversary of our camping trip. The boys pretend they don't hear them, but I see them check the locks on their windows before bed. Karen does too. We all do. Because somewhere out there, something is still wearing our faces, still learning how to be us. And one day, they might decide they've learned enough. I was 29 when I learned that some places in the mountains don't want you to leave. I'm an accountant, or I was, before what happened at the TechFlow corporate retreat. These days, I work from home exclusively, and I never go anywhere that doesn't have cell service. I know that probably sounds paranoid, but you'll understand by the end of this. TechFlow Incorporated was dying. Our startup had burned through most of its funding, and morale was somewhere below rock bottom. We'd gone from 15 employees down to 8, and everyone knew more layoffs were coming. That's when Rachel, our marketing director, made what she thought was a brilliant decision. She hired Wade Knox, an ex-military wilderness leadership consultant who promised to save our company through something he called adversity training. The retreat was scheduled for November in the George Washington National Forest. Wade chose the timing deliberately. He said, "Winter preparation builds real teamwork." Looking back, I think he chose November for other reasons that had nothing to do with team building. I grew up hiking these mountains with my grandfather, so I wasn't worried about the wilderness part. Grandpa used to tell stories about certain hollows in the old mountains, places where the Cherokee wouldn't hunt, where even the loggers in the 1,920 seconds refused to work. Some places, he'd say, got their own rules. Smart folks respect that. I thought they were just stories. Wade met with us twice before the retreat. He was exactly what you'd expect, military bearing, steel gray eyes, the kind of presence that filled a room. During his briefings, he emphasized digital detox and elimination of technological dependence. All phones, GPS devices, even watches, had to be surrendered. Real leaders adapt without artificial crutches, he said. The location was 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an overgrown logging trail that hadn't been maintained since the 1,970 seconds. Wade called it necessary isolation for authentic leadership development. The area was called Whispering Hollow on the old maps, though none of the newer GPS systems seemed to recognize the name. Our group consisted of 8 people: Rachel, 38, myself, Carlos from IT, 31, Susan from HR, 29, Tom from sales, 35, Maria, our newest hire, 24, Jamie, our junior accountant, 26, and David from customer service, 33. We were all desperate to save our jobs, which made us willing to accept Wade's increasingly strange methods. The first night should have warned us. After Wade confiscated our electronics, he gathered us around the fire and burned the trail map Rachel had brought. Real survival doesn't come with road maps, he said, watching our faces in the firelight. Emergency pickup is scheduled for 7 days. Until then, you learn what real leadership means. But that wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was the silence. I've spent dozens of nights camping in Appalachian wilderness, and there's always sound: owls, insects, wind through leaves, small animals moving in the underbrush. That first night, there was nothing. Complete, absolute silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Even our fire seemed to burn quieter than it should have. Wade didn't seem to notice. He was too busy implementing his hierarchy system, distributing supplies based on what he called corporate value contribution. Rachel got the best gear as director. Tom and I got decent supplies. But the junior employees, Jamie, Maria, David, got almost nothing. Thin sleeping bags, minimal food, no proper shelter. Resources are limited in survival situations, Wade explained. Leaders make hard allocation decisions. This teaches executive thinking. I should have objected then. Should have told Wade to go to hell and started hiking out. But I was afraid of losing my job, and besides, something about the place was making it hard to think clearly. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, and there was a constant metallic taste in my mouth. The second day, things got worse. Wade began using personal information from our employee files to manipulate us. He made Carlos detail his college debt to the group, calling it financial irresponsibility that demonstrates poor leadership. He forced Susan to admit her previous anxiety issues made her a liability in crisis situations. He was systematically breaking us down, but he was doing it in a way that felt almost rehearsed, like he'd done this before, in this exact place. That night, the sounds started. Around 2 a.m., I woke to what sounded like footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched through the dead leaves in a perfect circle about 50 yards out. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening, but the footsteps never got closer or farther away. Just that steady circling, like something was marking territory. I wasn't the only one who heard it. In the morning, Jamie looked exhausted. "Did you hear that walking last night?" she whispered when Wade was out of earshot. It went on for hours. Wade overheard. "Paranoia is a sign of weak mental discipline," he said. "Leaders don't jump at shadows." But I saw something in his eyes when he said it, not dismissal, recognition, like he'd been expecting us to hear things. Day 3 brought hypothermia. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and Jamie was in bad shape. Her lips were blue, she couldn't stop shivering, and she was having trouble forming coherent sentences. When I demanded Wade evacuate her, he refused. "Weakness eliminates itself in natural selection," he said. "If she can't adapt, that's valuable data about her leadership potential." That's when I knew Wade wasn't running a corporate retreat. He was conducting an experiment, but not the kind that belonged in any business journal. I started paying closer attention to Wade's equipment. During his watch shift, I noticed he had devices he'd kept hidden: a satellite communicator, military restraints, and what looked like sedatives. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. He had a leather journal, old and worn, filled with handwritten notes. I only glimpsed a few pages, but what I saw made no sense. Dates going back decades, names I didn't recognize, and rough maps of this exact area, marked with symbols that looked like they belonged in an anthropology textbook, not a business plan. One entry I could make out clearly: November 1987, Henderson Corp Group, 6 subjects, entity response confirmed after 72 hours of sustained stress and isolation. Henderson Corp. I'd heard of them. A mid-sized consulting firm that had gone bankrupt in the late 82nd after several employees disappeared during a corporate retreat in West Virginia. The case had never been solved. That night, the circling footsteps came back. But this time, they weren't alone. I woke around 1 a.m. to the sound of my own voice calling from the trees. Not similar to my voice, my exact voice, with my inflection, my speech patterns, calling my own name from the darkness beyond our fire. Jamie. The thing with my voice called, "Jamie, come here, I found something you need to see." I was lying in my sleeping bag, hadn't said a word. But Jamie was sitting up, looking confused and terrified. "That's you, calling me," she whispered, "but you're right here." The voice called again, and this time it was Carlos's voice calling for Susan. Then Tom's voice calling for Maria. One by one, our own voices were calling to each other from the tree line, trying to lure us away from the fire. Wade was awake. I could see his eyes reflecting the firelight, but he wasn't moving, wasn't speaking. He was just watching us, with the expression of a scientist observing lab rats. "What is that?" Susan hissed, but Wade held up a hand for silence. "Phase 2, he said quietly, making a note in his journal. "Right on schedule." That's when I understood. Wade hadn't brought us here for corporate training. He'd brought us here to feed something. Something that lived in Whispering Hollow. Something that had been hunting corporate retreat groups for decades. The voices in the trees began to multiply. Soon there were dozens of them, all using our voices, calling our names, begging us to come into the darkness. And underneath the familiar voices, I could hear something else. Breathing. Heavy, wet breathing from multiple sources, like a pack of enormous animals waiting just beyond the firelight. The entity requires sustained psychological stress to manifest fully, Wade said, still making notes. Isolation, hierarchy breakdown, and sleep deprivation create optimal feeding conditions. Corporate groups are ideal because they're already psychologically vulnerable. Rachel finally snapped. "What are you talking about? What entity?" Wade looked up from his journal, and his eyes were different now. Hungrier. The Cherokee called this place Nvihia-Hani, the hollow that hunts. Early loggers lost 3 crews here before they stopped trying to harvest the timber. The Forest Service has this area marked as unsuitable for recreational use in their private files. But corporate retreat permits? Those go through a different department, one that doesn't check the historical records. The breathing sounds were getting closer and louder, like whatever was out there was growing larger or multiplying or both. "Every November for 38 years, I've brought groups here," Wade continued. "The entity feeds on fear, desperation, and psychological breakdown. Corporate employees, especially ones facing job loss, provide exactly the right emotional conditions. The process usually takes 4 to 5 days of systematic stress induction." Through the trees, I could see shapes moving. Tall, wrong shapes that seemed to bend in ways that hurt to look at. They moved like people but felt ancient, patient, terrifyingly intelligent. "The ones it doesn't take," Wade said, "make excellent test cases for refining the process." That's when the screaming started. Maria was the first to break. She bolted from her sleeping bag and ran into the trees, toward the voices calling her name. We heard her scream once, then silence. Not the silence of distance, but the silence of something muffled, cut short. The shapes in the trees began to move faster. Circling closer, Carlos grabbed a burning branch from the fire. "We need to get out of here, now." But when we looked around, the trees had changed. The trail we'd hiked in on was gone. The landscape itself was different, like the hollow had rearranged itself while we weren't looking. We were trapped in a place that followed different rules than the rest of the world. Wade was laughing. There's no leaving until it's finished feeding. The entity controls the geography now. You can hike for days and never find a way out. Trust me, I've watched people try. The voices were getting more sophisticated. Now they weren't just calling our names, they were having full conversations, using our voices to tell us about family members in trouble, about cars broken down on distant roads, about anything that might make us leave the fire's protection. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me about the old Cherokee stories. The things that hunted in the deep mountains weren't just predators. They were intelligent, they learned, they adapted, and they had been learning about human behavior for a very, very long time. The entity doesn't just feed on fear, I said, understanding flooding through me. It learns from it. Every group Wade brings here teaches it more about how humans think, how we react, what makes us vulnerable. Susan was crying. So what do? I looked at the thing wearing Wade's face, still calmly taking notes, and realized he wasn't just a psychopath. He was a collaborator, something that had been working with the entity for decades, perfecting its hunting methods. We do what it doesn't expect, I said. We work together. In the corporate world, Wade had been systematically breaking down our team dynamics, turning us against each other. But the entity was expecting us to follow those patterns. It had learned to hunt isolated, desperate individuals. What it hadn't learned to hunt was a unified group that refused to break. Everyone stays by the fire, I said. No matter what you hear, no matter whose voice calls you, no one leaves this circle. The shapes in the trees were getting agitated. They began to make sounds not quite animal, not quite human, clicking, chittering noises that seemed to come from throats that weren't shaped quite right. Wade's expression had changed. For the first time since the retreat began, he looked uncertain. You don't understand, he said. The entity has been feeding here for centuries. It's part of this place now. Fighting it only makes the process more unpleasant. But Carlos was already working on something. He'd been quietly dismantling his portable battery pack, the one Wade had missed during the electronics confiscation. Now he was connecting wires to the metal frame of his pack. If this thing feeds on psychological stress, Carlos said, maybe it doesn't like electrical interference. He activated the improvised device, and immediately the voices from the trees became distorted, staticky. The shapes seemed to flicker, like bad television reception. The thing wearing Wade's face snarled. You're making a mistake. The entity doesn't like to be denied. It will hunt you individually, pick you off one by one, make the process last weeks instead of days. Then we don't give it the chance, I said. Tom was already gathering supplies. Susan was preparing the first aid kit for Jamie, who was still hypothermic but conscious. David was building up the fire. We were working as a team for the first time since the retreat began, and the entity didn't know how to respond. The shapes in the trees were moving chaotically now, no longer in their patient circle. The voices were overlapping, becoming confused, contradicting each other. Whatever intelligence guided them had learned to hunt frightened, isolated individuals. It hadn't learned to hunt a group that refused to break apart. Wade pulled a knife from his pack. If you won't participate willingly, I'll provide the psychological trauma manually. But 8 people working together are stronger than one man with a knife, no matter how well trained. We subdued Wade using basic teamwork, the kind we should have been learning all along. When we tied him up with his own restraints, something interesting happened. The voices from the trees became quieter. The shapes moved farther away, like the entity was losing power as Wade lost control. Carlos's electromagnetic device wasn't just interfering with the entity, it was disrupting whatever connection Wade had with it. As the device ran, Wade began to change. His face looked older, more haggard, like something had been keeping him artificially sustained. 38 years, he gasped. I've been feeding it for 38 years. It promised me immortality if I kept bringing groups. But the entity had been lying. Wade was aging rapidly now, decades of postponed time catching up with him all at once. Within minutes, he looked ancient, desiccated, more like a mummy than a living person. The shapes in the trees were retreating now, moving deeper into the hollow. Whatever power the entity possessed, it was weakening as its human collaborator failed. As dawn broke, the forest began to sound normal again. Birds singing, insects buzzing, wind through leaves. The electromagnetic interference had somehow broken the entity's hold on the geography, because when we looked around, the trail back to civilization was visible again. We hiked out carrying Wade's body, what was left of it. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac event during wilderness training exercise. The investigation into his corporate consulting firm revealed evidence of fraud, but nothing supernatural. 38 years of missing persons cases were quietly closed as death by misadventure. TechFlow Incorporated survived. Ironically, the shared trauma had bonded us into the most effective team the company had ever had. We restructured around collaborative leadership, focusing on employee support and mutual aid. The company grew, thrived, became everything Wade's actual methods could never have achieved. But I never went back to those mountains. None of us did. And every November, when the air gets cold and the leaves start falling, I remember the voices in the trees, calling our names with our own voices, trying to lure us away from the fire, away from each other, into the darkness where something patient and hungry was waiting. I still work for TechFlow, but I work from home now. I live in the suburbs, where the biggest trees are decorative maples and the only sounds at night are traffic and distant TVs. I know some people think I'm paranoid, but I sleep better knowing nothing can circle my house in the darkness, because some places in the mountains don't want you to leave. And some things that live there have learned too much about human nature to ever be truly defeated. They're just waiting for the next group of desperate, isolated people to wander into their territory. They're very, very patient. And they're still learning. I was 34 when my startup went to hell, and honestly, looking back now, I should have known that weekend in West Virginia would be a disaster from the start. My name's David, and I'd been running this software company for 3 years, 7 employees, all of us grinding away in a cramped office in Arlington, trying to build something that mattered. We were maybe 6 weeks out from launching our main product, this project management platform we'd been developing forever, and the whole team was burned out. Sarah, our lead programmer, hadn't taken a real day off in months. Mike from design was practically sleeping at his desk. Everyone was stressed, snippy, making mistakes we couldn't afford to make. That's when Lisa from marketing suggested we do some kind of team retreat. Get out of the city, she said. Reconnect with nature, think outside the box, all that corporate wellness stuff. I'll be honest, it sounded like expensive nonsense to me. But morale was so bad I was worried people were going to start quitting. So I told her to find something cheap and close. Maybe a long weekend, somewhere we could do actual work, but also, I don't know, bond as a team or whatever. She came back with this place in Pocahontas County, deep in the West Virginia mountains. Used to be a coal mining operation back in the 60s, but somebody had converted the old buildings into what they called a rustic corporate retreat center. The photos looked pretty cool. These massive concrete structures built right into the hillside, conference rooms set up in what used to be equipment storage areas, even some meeting spaces down in the old mine tunnels. The whole selling point was that it was this authentic industrial experience where teams could think creatively in a unique environment. The price was right, and honestly, the novelty factor appealed to me. I figured if we were going to spend money on team building, at least we'd have a good story to tell afterward. Plus, the place was only about 4 hours from Arlington, so we could drive down Friday morning, spend the weekend, and be back Sunday night. Perfect for a small company that couldn't afford to lose too much work time. So that's how I ended up driving a rented van through the mountains of West Virginia on a cold Friday morning in November, with my entire company crammed in behind me arguing about music choices and complaining about the lack of cell service. Sarah was navigating with an actual paper map because GPS kept losing signal once we got past Lewisburg. Mike had his laptop out trying to get some last-minute work done until the battery died and there were no outlets in the van. Lisa was taking photos of everything, excited about documenting our corporate adventure for social media, assuming we could ever get back online to post them. The retreat center was way more isolated than I'd expected from the website. We drove for maybe 30 minutes on increasingly narrow mountain roads, past abandoned farmhouses and rusted-out mining equipment scattered in the woods, before finally reaching this gravel driveway that wound up the side of a steep ridge. The buildings were impressive, I'll give them that. These massive concrete bunkers built right into the rock face, connected by metal walkways and stairs that zigzagged down the hillside. You could see where they'd tried to make it look welcoming with some landscaping and fresh paint on the railings, but underneath it all, this place still felt like heavy industry. Our host was this guy named Frank, probably in his 60s, who'd worked the mines back when they were operational and now managed the retreat center. He met us in the main parking area and walked us through the facilities. Conference rooms set up in what used to be equipment bays, dining areas in converted office spaces, and sleeping quarters in modified storage buildings. Everything was clean and functional, but you couldn't escape the feeling that you were basically camping inside an old factory. The coolest part, though, was the underground conference center. Frank led us down this wide concrete ramp that sloped into the hillside through these heavy metal doors. And suddenly, we were in this huge room carved right out of the rock. They'd set it up with tables and whiteboards and all the usual meeting stuff, but the walls were still rough stone, and you could see the tool marks where the miners had blasted through. Frank explained that this used to be an equipment staging area, where they'd store and maintain the big machines before sending them deeper into the mine system. Mine goes back maybe 2 miles, Frank told us, gesturing toward a metal gate at the far end of the room. Most of it's sealed off now for safety, but we do guided tours of the first few hundred yards. Part of the experience, you know? Help folks understand what this place used to be. That first day went better than I'd hoped. There was something about being in such a unique space that actually did seem to get everyone's creative juices flowing. We spent the afternoon brainstorming solutions to some problems we'd been stuck on for weeks, and by evening, the whole team seemed more relaxed and focused than they'd been in months. We had dinner in the main building, nothing fancy, just sandwiches and soup, but Frank's wife cooked it, and it was good. And then headed back to our rooms early to get ready for more work sessions the next day. The sleeping quarters were in these converted storage buildings scattered around the hillside, connected by metal walkways. I was sharing a room with Mike, while Sarah and Lisa had the room next door. The other 3 employees, Tom, Jessica, and Robert, were in a building about 50 yards away, closer to the main conference area. Each building had 4 or 5 rooms, but we were the only guests that weekend, so the whole place felt pretty empty. That's when we first heard the sounds. I was lying in bed, around midnight, listening to Mike snore and thinking about our product timeline, when I heard this scratching noise coming from somewhere outside. At first, I figured it was just normal mountain sounds, maybe a raccoon getting into the trash, or branches scraping against the building in the wind. But as I lay there listening, the scratching seemed to move along the wall of our building, like something was walking around the perimeter, dragging its claws against the metal siding. I got up and looked out the window, but there were only a few security lights scattered around the complex, and most of the hillside was pitch black. The scratching stopped as soon as I moved, like whatever was out there knew I was watching. I stood at the window for maybe 10 minutes, but I didn't see anything moving, so I went back to bed and tried to forget about it. The next morning at breakfast, Tom mentioned he'd heard weird noises during the night too. Sounded like something big walking around on the metal walkways, he said. But when I looked out, there was nothing there. Frank just nodded like this was normal. Lots of wildlife up here, he said. Bears, mostly. Sometimes they get curious about the buildings, but they don't cause any real trouble. Just don't leave food out in your rooms. That made sense, and honestly, I was more focused on our second day of workshops than on whatever animals might be wandering around outside. We spent the morning working on user interface designs. Then, after lunch, Frank offered to take us on the mine tour he'd mentioned. Most of the team was interested. It seemed like a good way to break up the afternoon and learn something about the history of the place. Frank led us back down to the underground conference room, then unlocked the metal gate at the far end and ushered us into the tunnel system beyond. He had heavy-duty flashlights for everyone, plus some battery-powered work lights on extension cords that he set up every 50 yards or so to keep the main pathway lit. The tunnels were incredible. These weren't narrow mine shafts like you see in movies. They were wide enough to drive trucks through, with arched ceilings carved out of solid rock and metal support beams every few yards. Frank explained that this section had been used for moving equipment and supplies, so everything was built big enough for the massive machines they used to bring in and out. We walked maybe 300 yards into the hillside, with Frank pointing out different features and telling stories about what it was like to work down here back in the day. The air was cool and damp, with this metallic smell that I guess came from decades of machinery and blasting powder. Our footsteps echoed weirdly off the walls, and even with all the lights, the darkness seemed to press in around us. That's when Sarah pointed out that we were hearing other sounds. "Listen," she said, stopping and holding up her hand for quiet. We all stopped walking, and sure enough, there was something else moving in the tunnels. Not our echoes, this was coming from a different direction, deeper in the mine system. It sounded like footsteps, but the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, like something heavy was taking its time walking through the darkness. Frank frowned and aimed his flashlight toward the sound, but the tunnel curved about 100 yards ahead of us, and the beam didn't reach far enough to show anything. "That's strange," he said. "This section should be completely sealed off." The footsteps stopped as soon as we started listening for them, just like the scratching sounds from the night before. We stood there in silence for maybe 30 seconds, but we didn't hear anything else. "Probably just water dripping," Frank said, but he didn't sound convinced. "These old mines, sounds can carry for miles and get distorted, makes your imagination run wild." We finished the tour, but everyone was quieter on the walk back. There was something about those tunnels that felt wrong, like we were being watched from the darkness beyond our lights. When we got back to the conference room, I noticed Frank locked the metal gate behind us and double-checked the lock, which he hadn't done on the way in. That evening, we tried to get back to our normal workshop routine, but everyone was distracted. The sounds from the tunnels had gotten under our skin somehow, and even though we were back in the well-lit conference room, we all kept glancing toward that locked gate like we expected something to come through it. Around 9 o'clock, we decided to call it a day early. Everyone was tired, and honestly, the underground conference room was starting to feel claustrophobic. We headed back up to the surface and split up to go to our respective buildings. I was almost asleep when the real noise started. This wasn't scratching or footsteps. This was like someone, or something, was trying to get into our building. I could hear what sounded like hands or claws testing the door handle, pressing against the windows, tapping on the metal walls. Mike was awake too, sitting up in his bed and listening. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and crept over to the window. Whatever was outside had moved around to the side of the building, but I could see something pale moving just at the edge of the security light's reach. It was too big to be any normal animal, and it was moving wrong, not like a bear or deer, but with this weird, lurching gait that made my skin crawl. Then I heard Sarah scream from the next building over. I grabbed my clothes and shoes and told Mike to do the same. We could hear voices now from the other buildings. Everyone was awake, and it sounded like whatever was out there was checking all of our rooms, methodically moving from building to building. My first thought was to get to the main conference center where Frank was staying, but when we opened our door and looked out, we could see something moving on the walkway between us and the central building. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked like a person. If a person could be 8 feet tall and move like their joints were in all the wrong places. Mike pointed toward the underground entrance. "The tunnel," he said. "We can get to the main building through the conference room." It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than trying to run past whatever was lurking on the walkways above ground. We made it to the tunnel entrance without being seen, and I used my phone to light our way down the concrete ramp. The metal doors were unlocked, and we slipped into the underground conference room just as we heard more commotion from the surface. That's when we realized we weren't alone down there either. The gate to the mine tunnels was standing wide open, and we could hear movement in the darkness beyond. Not footsteps this time, something that sounded like dragging, like something heavy was being pulled across the stone floor. And there was breathing, deep and labored, echoing from multiple directions in the tunnel system. Mike grabbed my arm. "There's more than one," he whispered. I was trying to figure out what to do when the rest of the team stumbled into the conference room. They'd all had the same idea we did, running for the tunnels when things got too scary on the surface. Sarah's face was white, and her hands were shaking. "It was looking in our window," she said, "this pale thing with huge eyes, just standing there staring at us. When it saw me looking back, it smiled." Lisa was crying, trying to get a signal on her phone. "We need to call for help. This is insane." Tom had grabbed a fire extinguisher from one of the hallways, and Robert was holding a chair like a weapon. Jessica was just standing there in shock, staring at the open gate to the mine tunnels. That's when Frank showed up. running down the ramp with a shotgun in his hands and a wild look in his eyes. "Did you open this gate?" he demanded, pointing at the tunnel entrance. "It was already open when we got here," I said. Frank cursed and aimed his flashlight into the tunnels. The breathing sounds had stopped when he arrived, but you could still feel something watching from the darkness. "They're not supposed to be able to get through the barriers," he muttered. "I check them every month, make sure all the seals are intact." "What are they?" Sarah asked. Frank looked at us for a long moment, like he was trying to decide how much to tell us. Finally, he sighed and lowered the shotgun. "This mine's been closed for 60 years, he said, "but it was never really empty. The company sealed off the deeper sections when they shut down operations, but they didn't get everyone out first. Some of the miners were trapped in a cave-in about 3 miles back. Took weeks for the rescue teams to reach them. And by then," he shook his head. "Well, by then, something had changed." "Changed how?" Mike asked. "The ones they brought out weren't quite right anymore. Pale, couldn't handle sunlight, moved different, and they were hungry all the time. Not for food, exactly, but for something else. The mining company hushed it all up, relocated the families, sealed everything off. But the miners who were still trapped deeper in the system, the ones they couldn't reach, they adapted." A sound echoed from the tunnels, not breathing this time, but something that might have been laughter, if laughter could sound that hollow and empty. "They've been down there ever since," Frank continued, "living in the deep tunnels, surviving on. I don't know what they eat. But every few years, they get curious about what's happening on the surface. Usually I can keep them contained, make sure the barriers hold, but tonight," he gestured helplessly at the open gate. "Tonight they got through," I said. "They're not just mindless anymore," Frank said. 60 years down there, they've learned things, how to work together, how to use tools, how to plan, and they remember what it was like to be human, even if they can't ever go back to it." Something moved in the tunnel entrance, just a glimpse of pale flesh and 2 long limbs, there and gone again in the space of a heartbeat. "So, what do we do?" Lisa asked. Frank thought for a moment, then started unplugging the extension cords for the work lights. "They don't like bright light, and they're not used to technology. If we can get back to the van, get off the mountain." "What about the ones on the surface?" Tom asked. "There's maybe 3 or 4 of them total," Frank said. "But they know this place better than we do, and they can see in the dark. Our best bet is to move fast, stay in a group, and get to the vehicle before they can coordinate." I'll be honest, it wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than hiding in the conference room all night waiting for those things to figure out how to get past Frank's shotgun. We gathered up what lights we could carry and prepared to make a run for the parking area. That's when the power went out. The whole complex went dark at once. Not just the conference room, but all the security lights on the surface. Everything. We were standing in absolute blackness, listening to the sound of our own breathing and trying not to panic. Frank's flashlight came on first, then our phones, but the small pools of light just made the darkness around us seem deeper and more threatening. We could hear movement now, both from the tunnels behind us and from the entrance ramp ahead. They had us surrounded. "Stay close," Frank whispered. "And whatever happens, don't run alone. They pick off stragglers." We started up the ramp in a tight group, Frank leading with the shotgun and the rest of us clustered behind him. With our lights, I could see shapes moving just beyond our flashlight beams, pale figures that seemed to flow rather than walk, keeping pace with us, but staying out of sight. We made it to the surface, but the van was maybe 200 yards away across open ground, and I could see more of those things positioning themselves between us and the parking area. They were coordinating, using hand signals I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "They're hurting us," Sarah said, and she was right. Every time we tried to angle toward the van, more figures would appear to block our path, forcing us to move in the direction they wanted. "The maintenance building," Frank said, pointing to a small structure about 50 yards away. "There's tools there, better lights. If we can hold out until dawn." We made another run, this time toward the maintenance shed. The pale figures closed in as we moved, and I got my first really clear look at what we were dealing with. They had been human once, but 60 years underground had changed them in fundamental ways. Their skin was translucent white, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long and joints that bent in impossible directions. Their eyes were huge and colorless, reflecting our flashlight beams like an animal's, and their mouths were full of teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human face. We reached the maintenance building, and Frank kicked in the door. Inside were work lights, portable generators, toolboxes full of equipment. He got a generator running and plugged in a string of bright fluorescent work lights, flooding the area around the building with harsh white light. The pale figures immediately retreated, but they didn't go far. They formed a loose circle around our little island of illumination, just beyond the reach of the lights, waiting. "Now what?" Jessica asked. Frank was checking his shotgun and counting shells. "Now we wait for sunrise and hope my generator has enough fuel to last." But the longer we sat there, surrounded by those things, the more I realized they weren't just waiting randomly. They were testing the boundaries of our light, probing for weak spots, learning, and every few minutes, one of them would make a quick dash closer to the building, forcing us to aim our lights at it to drive it back. They were wearing us down, exhausting our lights and our energy, while they had all night to work with. That's when I remembered something from our earlier team building exercises. We'd spent hours working on project management scenarios, breaking big problems down into manageable tasks, and coordinating resources efficiently. These things might know the terrain better than us, but they were operating on instinct and whatever intelligence they'd managed to develop in isolation. We had something they didn't: 60 years of human innovation and the ability to work as an organized team. "The van keys are in my pocket," I told the group. "If we can get someone to the vehicle, they can drive it closer to the building and we can all escape together." "But how do we get past them?" Mike asked. That's when Sarah had the brilliant idea that probably saved our lives. She'd been examining the work tools Frank had in the maintenance building, and she'd found something interesting: a bunch of emergency flares and some kind of industrial strobe lights that the mining operation had used for safety signals. "If they don't like bright light, let's give them more than they can handle," she said. We spent the next hour setting up what was essentially a coordinated light show. Using extension cords from the generator, we positioned the strobe lights around the building in a pattern that would create overlapping fields of flashing illumination. The emergency flares would serve as backup lighting and mobile weapons if we needed them. The plan was for me to make a run for the van, while the others created maximum light distraction. It was risky, but sitting in the maintenance building all night wasn't sustainable. The generator was already starting to sound rough, and we were running low on fuel. When we triggered our light array, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The pale figures scattered like roaches when you turn on a kitchen light, retreating much farther from the building than they had before. The strobes were particularly effective. Every flash seemed to cause them physical pain, making them cover their oversized eyes and stumble. I ran for the van while the others kept the lights going, and somehow I made it without being intercepted. The engine started on the first try, and I drove as close to the maintenance building as I could get, honking the horn and keeping the headlights aimed at any of those things that tried to approach. Getting everyone from the building to the van was the most terrifying 30 seconds of my life. We had to abandon most of the lights, and in the brief darkness between the building and the vehicle, I could see the pale figures closing in from all directions. But we made it, all 8 of us piling into the van just as those things reached the edge of the headlight beams. I drove off that mountain faster than I've ever driven in my life, taking curves on 2 wheels and not slowing down until we reached the main highway. None of us said much during the drive back to Arlington. What was there to say? We'd all seen the same impossible things, lived through the same nightmare, but we also knew that no one would ever believe us if we tried to explain it. Frank had given us his contact information and made us promise not to talk to authorities or media about what had happened. "Those things have been contained for 60 years, he'd said. "Drawing attention to them now won't help anyone." We never did launch our software platform. The whole team was too shaken up to focus on work for weeks afterward, and by the best time, we might have been ready to try again. 3 people had quit, and the company basically fell apart. I ended up selling what assets we had and taking a regular job at a bigger tech company. Something stable where I didn't have to make decisions or take risks. It's been 8 years now, and I still don't sleep well in complete darkness. I keep lights on in every room of my house, and I've never been camping or hiking since that weekend. Sarah moved to California and works for Google now, but we still email occasionally, and she's never gone underground for any reason. No subway systems, no basement apartments, nothing below ground level. Mike started having panic attacks whenever he heard about mining accidents or cave rescues on the news, and eventually had to start seeing a therapist. Lisa quit tech altogether and teaches elementary school now. The others scattered to different jobs in different cities, but as far as I know, none of us ever took another corporate retreat. I drive past the exit for Pocahontas County sometimes when I'm traveling for work, and I always wonder if Frank is still up there, still keeping those things contained in the deep tunnels. I hope he is, because I know they're still down there, learning and adapting and waiting for their next chance to see what the surface world has to offer. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in my well-lit office, I'll hear a sound in the building that reminds me of those pale figures moving through the darkness, and I'll remember that there are things in this world that corporate team-building exercises never prepare you for. I'm 63 years old, and I've been hiking these mountains for over 30 years. Used to be a postal worker down in Harrisonburg, Virginia, but I retired last spring with a decent pension and nothing but time on my hands. My wife passed 2 years back, and my kids are all grown with families of their own, scattered across 3 different states. I guess you could say I was looking for something to fill the empty spaces in my life, and the mountains had always been that place for me. I'd been planning this trek through the George Washington National Forest since before I even retired. 40 miles of backcountry trail, spread out over 4 days in November when the crowds thin out and the air gets crisp enough to make your lungs feel clean again. My daughter Sarah thought I was crazy. "Dad, you're not 25 anymore." But honestly, I felt stronger at 63 than some folks half my age. 30 years of weekend hiking will do that for you. I had good gear, knew the trails better than most park rangers, and I'd left a detailed itinerary with Sarah that included every campsite and checkpoint along the route. The thing about solo hiking is that it strips everything down to what really matters. No conversations to distract you from your own thoughts. No one else's pace to worry about. Just you and the rhythm of your boots on the trail and whatever's going on inside your head. I'd done plenty of solo day hikes over the years, but this was going to be my first multi-day solo trek. Part of me saw it as a test. Could I still handle the backcountry on my own, or was I kidding myself about what this old body could do? I started the hike on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. The weather forecast called for 4 days of clear skies with temperatures in the 40s during the day and dipping down to the 20s at night. Perfect hiking weather, if you ask me. Cold enough that you don't overheat on the climbs, but not so cold that you're miserable when you stop moving. I'd packed my good sleeping bag, the one rated for 20 below, and enough food to last 6 days in case something went wrong. The trail started at a small parking area off Forest Service Road 42, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I'd hiked sections of this route before, but never the whole thing in one go. The plan was to cover about 10 miles each day, staying at designated wilderness campsites that were marked on my topographic maps. I'd studied those maps for months, memorizing every contour line and creek crossing. That first day went exactly according to plan. The trail wound through mixed hardwood forest, mostly oak and maple with some scattered pine. The leaves were already down, so I had good visibility in all directions and could appreciate the way the bare branches created these intricate patterns against the sky. I made good time, stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook where I could see 3 different mountain ridges stretching out into the distance, and reached my first campsite by 4 in the afternoon. The campsite sat in a small clearing beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth granite rocks. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and cooked myself a simple dinner of instant pasta and canned chicken. As the sun went down, I sat by my small camp stove and watched the stars come out one by one. It was the kind of peaceful evening that reminded me why I loved being out there, away from traffic and television and all the noise of regular life. I woke up the next morning feeling rested and optimistic. My legs felt good, no soreness from the previous day's hike, and my pack felt lighter somehow, like my body was already adjusting to the routine. I made coffee, ate some oatmeal with dried fruit, and broke camp efficiently. By 8:30, I was back on the trail, heading deeper into the forest. That's when I first started feeling like something was watching me. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just this nagging sensation that made me glance over my shoulder every few minutes. You know how it is when you're hiking alone. your mind starts playing tricks on you, making you hyper-aware of every sound and movement. I figured it was just normal solo hiking paranoia, the kind of thing that happens when you spend too much time alone in the woods. But the feeling persisted, getting stronger as the morning wore on. The trail that day took me through sections of old-growth forest that felt different from anything I'd hiked before. These were trees that had been growing for hundreds of years, massive oaks and chestnuts with trunks so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around them. The forest floor was thick with decades of fallen leaves, and the canopy overhead was so dense that even without leaves, it filtered the sunlight into this greenish, underwater kind of glow. Around 10 o'clock, I stopped to take a water break and noticed something that made me pause. The forest was completely silent, not just quiet, silent. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Even the wind had died down to nothing. In 30 years of hiking, I'd never experienced that kind of absolute quiet in a healthy forest during daylight hours. It felt wrong somehow, like the whole ecosystem was holding its breath. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat and the sound of my breathing. Then, from somewhere high up in the canopy above me, I heard what sounded like a large branch creaking under weight. I looked up, scanning the treetops for any sign of what might have caused it. These old-growth trees had branches as thick as telephone poles, but I couldn't see anything moving up there. No bear, no large bird, nothing that would explain the sound. When I started hiking again, the feeling of being watched intensified. It seemed to be coming from above, like something was keeping pace with me in the watch, treetops. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that would vanish the moment I turned my head to look directly at them. I told myself it was probably just ravens or maybe a hawk following me out of curiosity, but the shapes seemed too large and too deliberate to be birds. About an hour later, I found the first broken branch. It was lying across the trail, a massive piece of oak that had to be at least 8 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. But here's what bothered me. The break was clean, like something had snapped it off rather than it falling naturally. And when I looked up to see where it had come from, I realized it had broken off from a height of at least 20 feet. No wind could have done that, not to a healthy oak branch that thick. And if an animal had somehow broken it, what kind of animal could reach that high and have that kind of strength? I moved the branch off the trail and kept hiking, but my mind was working overtime trying to come up with reasonable explanations. Maybe the branch had been damaged in a previous storm and finally gave way. Maybe ice had weakened it over the winter. But the break looked fresh, and there were green leaves still attached to the smaller twigs. Over the next 2 hours, I found 3 more broken branches, each one massive, and each one broken off at a height that didn't make sense for any animal I could think of. They weren't blocking the trail, just lying near it, like someone or something had been breaking them off and dropping them as markers. Around noon, I stopped for lunch at a small clearing where a seasonal creek cut through the forest. While I was eating my sandwich, I heard footsteps. Not human footsteps, something heavier, with a longer stride. They seemed to be moving through the forest parallel to the trail, maybe 50 yards to my right. The steps were deliberate and measured, and they stopped whenever I stopped moving. When I stood up to get a better look, the footsteps stopped too. When I sat back down, they resumed. I finished my lunch quickly and got back on the trail, but the footsteps continued. Sometimes they came from the right side of the trail, sometimes from the left, always maintaining the same distance, always stopping when I stopped. I tried walking very quietly to see if I could hear them more clearly, but whatever was making the sound was good at moving through the forest. I could hear the footfalls, but no breaking twigs or rustling leaves that you'd expect from a large animal moving through thick underbrush. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to get genuinely nervous. The feeling of being watched had become constant, and now I was hearing evidence that something large was definitely tracking my movement. I thought about turning around and heading back to my car, but I was already 8 or 9 miles from the trailhead, and I'd have to cover the same distance in reverse to get out. Plus, whatever was following me would presumably follow me back too. I decided to push on to my planned campsite and reevaluate the situation once I got there. Maybe whatever was tracking me would lose interest if I stayed in one place for a while, and if it didn't, at least I'd have my tent and a controlled environment to work with. The campsite was in another small clearing, this one beside a spring that bubbled up from between some large granite boulders. It was a beautiful spot, probably one of the most scenic campsites in the whole forest. But as I set up my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being studied by something that was trying to figure out what I was doing and whether I posed a threat. Just before sunset, I saw it clearly for the first time. I was sitting by my camp stove, heating up some soup for dinner, when I happened to glance toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. There, standing perfectly motionless between two large oaks, was something that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. It was humanoid in shape but enormous, easily 10 or 11 feet tall, with proportions that were almost human but not quite right. Its arms were too long, hanging down past where its knees would be. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its head seemed small in comparison to the massive trunk of its body. The whole thing was covered in dark hair or fur, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear. It was more like human hair, just much thicker and coarser. We stared at each other for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. It didn't move at all during that time, not even to breathe, as far as I could tell. It just stood there, studying me, with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and thoughtful. Not the blank curiosity of an animal, but the focused attention of something trying to understand what I was and what I was doing in its territory. Then, without any transition or movement that I could see, it was gone. Not like it stepped back into the forest or moved away. It just wasn't there anymore, like it had dissolved into the shadows between the trees. I sat there, staring at the spot where it had been, wondering if my eyes had been playing tricks on me, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it had been real. Whatever that thing was, it was massive, intelligent, and it had been watching me all day. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside my tent made me freeze and listen, trying to determine if it was wind or settling trees or something large moving around my campsite. Several times I heard what sounded like breathing or soft footsteps circling my tent, but whenever I unzipped the rainfly to look outside, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The third day started early because I'd given up on sleep around 5 in the morning. I made coffee and ate breakfast while it was still dark, then packed up my tent and got back on the trail as soon as there was enough light to see. I was hoping that by starting early and moving fast, I might be able to get ahead of whatever had been following me. But within an hour of starting the hike, I could tell it was still there. The footsteps in the forest paralleling my route, the feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence of the birds and small animals. If anything, its presence seemed stronger now, like it had spent the night deciding what to do about me and had reached some kind of conclusion. Around 9 o'clock, I found something that made me stop in my tracks and seriously consider abandoning the hike altogether. In a muddy area beside a small stream crossing, there were handprints, or footprints. I honestly couldn't tell which because they didn't look quite like either. They were enormous, probably 14 or 15 inches long and almost as wide, and they showed clear finger or toe impressions, but the proportions were wrong for either hands or feet. The digits were too long and thick, and they were arranged in a pattern that didn't quite match human anatomy. There were 3 of them pressed deep into the mud, and they looked fresh. The edges were still sharp and clean, like they'd been made within the last few hours. Standing next to them, I felt like a child. My own boot prints looked tiny in comparison. I took photos with my phone, though I wasn't sure anyone would believe them. The prints could have been faked, I suppose, though I couldn't imagine how or why someone would go to the trouble of creating fake monster tracks in the middle of nowhere. And the size and depth suggested something that weighed several hundred pounds at least. As I stood there, staring at the prints, I heard a sound that raised every hair on my body, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a call. It sounded almost like someone trying to speak, but not quite getting the mechanics of it right. The sound rolled through the forest for maybe 10 seconds, then faded away, leaving that unnatural silence behind. I realized that whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate with me. Not necessarily in a friendly way, but it was definitely attempting some form of contact. And given its size and obvious intelligence, I figured my best bet was to show that I understood I was in its territory and that I meant no harm. I backed away from the stream, crossing slowly, keeping my hands visible and avoiding any sudden movements. Then I sat down on a fallen log and waited, trying to project as much non-threatening body language as possible. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that most animals will leave you alone if you don't act like a threat or prey. After about 15 minutes, I heard movement in the trees to my right. Branches swaying and creaking under weight, but moving slowly and deliberately, rather than with the chaotic breaking you'd expect from an animal crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was taking care to move through the forest in a controlled way, like it understood the environment and knew how to navigate it efficiently. The sounds gradually moved to a position directly ahead of me, maybe 40 yards away. Then they stopped, and I could feel that focused attention again, like I was being evaluated for something. I stayed still and kept my breathing steady, trying to show that I wasn't a threat but also wasn't easy prey. Then something remarkable happened. From the forest ahead of me came a series of sounds, branches being broken deliberately and placed in specific ways. I could hear the snapping and the soft thuds as they hit the ground, but the pattern was too regular to be random. It was like someone was building something or arranging materials in a specific configuration. After about 10 minutes, the sounds stopped, and I heard the heavy footsteps moving away to my left, fading gradually into the distance. I waited another 10 minutes to make sure whatever it was had really left, then I got up and moved carefully toward where the sounds had come from. What I found was an arrangement of broken branches that defied any natural explanation. They'd been woven together into a rough but recognizable shelter. Not sophisticated, but definitely intentional. It was big enough for a human to crawl inside, and it was positioned in a way that would provide protection from wind and rain. The construction showed planning and spatial reasoning that went way beyond anything an animal should be capable of. I stood there, staring at this primitive shelter, trying to process what it meant. The creature had built something for me, not for itself. The scale was all wrong for something its size. It had listened to my movements, assessed my size, and constructed a shelter that would fit me. That level of reasoning and empathy was almost human. I didn't use the shelter. I was too nervous about the implications, but I left some of my trail mix and a granola bar beside it as a gesture of appreciation. Then I continued on the trail, feeling like I'd just participated in some kind of first contact scenario between species. The rest of that day passed without incident, though I continued to feel watched. The creature seemed to be maintaining its distance now, and the footsteps in the forest were fainter and less frequent. I made it to my third campsite without any direct encounters, though I found more evidence of its presence. Broken branches arranged in patterns, large impressions in soft earth, and trees that had been marked with claw scratches at a height of 8 or 9 feet. That night, as I sat by my camp stove eating dinner, I heard it moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Not threatening, but definitely present. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. It was like it wanted me to know it was there, but didn't want full visual contact. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something large, settling down just outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breaths that were definitely not human, but weren't quite animal either. I lay there listening for what felt like hours, but eventually the sound faded away and I managed to fall back asleep. The fourth and final day of my hike was the strangest yet. The creature's presence was constant, but somehow different, less threatening and more protective, I guess. A couple of times during the morning, I found that fallen trees had been moved off the trail ahead of me, clearing obstacles that would have required significant effort to climb over or go around. Once, when I was studying my map at a confusing trail junction, I heard the sound of stones being deliberately thrown. When I looked toward the sound, I could see a small cairn of rocks that hadn't been there before, positioned to mark the correct trail. It was guiding me. This massive, presumably ancient creature was helping me navigate its territory safely and efficiently. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. Late that afternoon, I reached the end point of my hike, another small parking area where Sarah was supposed to pick me up. As I came out of the trees and saw my daughter's car waiting in the gravel lot, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with something like sadness. I was leaving behind an experience that had changed my understanding of what was possible in the world. I turned around to look back at the forest one last time before getting in the car. There, standing just inside the tree line where the shadows were deepest, I could see the outline of my watcher. It was perfectly still, the way it had been that first evening when I'd seen it clearly. We looked at each other across the distance of maybe 50 yards, and I raised my hand in what I hoped would be understood as a gesture of respect and gratitude. It didn't move, but I had the distinct impression that it understood. That was 8 months ago, and I haven't been back to that section of forest since. Not because I'm afraid, but because I feel like I was given a glimpse of something that's supposed to remain hidden, and it wouldn't be right to intrude again. I've done some research on the area's history, and there are Cherokee stories about guardians of the deep forest that match what I experienced. Ancient protectors that watch over the old-growth areas and decide who's worthy of safe passage. I still hike regularly, but I stick to more popular trails now, places where there are other people around. I've become more interested in forest conservation too, volunteering with groups that work to preserve wilderness areas and old-growth forests. I figure if there are things out there that old and that intelligent, they deserve to have their territory, protected from development and human interference. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I will, but a bigger part of me is content knowing that there are still mysteries in the world, still places where ancient things continue to exist just beyond the edge of human understanding. In an age when everything seems mapped and cataloged and explained, it's oddly comforting to know that some secrets are still safe. I never told Sarah or anyone else in my family what really happened during those 4 days. How do you explain something like that without sounding like you've lost your mind? But I know what I experienced, and I know it was real. There's something out there in the deep forest, something old and wise and powerful, and for 4 days I was allowed to share its territory. Looking back, I think it was testing me the whole time, watching how I treated the forest, whether I showed respect for the environment, whether I was the kind of person who could be trusted with the knowledge of its existence. And I must have passed the test, because I made it out safely with memories I'll carry for the rest of my life. I'm 64 now, and I probably don't have too many more years of serious hiking ahead of me. But when I think about that creature still out there, still watching over its ancient territory, I feel like I'm part of something larger than myself. Something that connects the present to a time when the world was wilder and stranger and full of possibilities we've forgotten how to imagine. I was 28 when I learned that some truths are too terrible to bear, and that Mirror Lake doesn't just reveal secrets, it feeds on them. I'm a dental hygienist in Asheville, and back then I was dating Marcus, this mechanic who drank too much and had a gambling problem I didn't know about yet. We'd been together 4 years, fighting constantly about money and the future, but neither of us had the guts to end it. When our anniversary rolled around that November, Marcus suggested a hiking trip to some romantic overlook he'd found online. Said we needed to reconnect. I agreed because I'd found the receipt for an engagement ring and knew he was planning to propose, which terrified me because I'd already decided to break up with him. The drive up to the Blue Ridge Parkway was tense. We kept snapping at each other over directions, radio stations, whether we'd packed enough food, all these little fights that revealed how incompatible we'd become. Marcus had been acting strange for weeks, secretive about his phone, defensive about money, drinking more than usual. I'd started checking his browser history and bank statements behind his back, which made me feel sick about myself, but I couldn't stop. We were both lying about everything, performing this fake happiness for friends and family, while quietly despising each other. The trail Marcus picked was supposed to be this scenic loop that ended at a romantic overlook perfect for sunset proposals. He'd researched it obsessively, bought a new camera, packed an elaborate picnic. I felt like I was walking to my own execution. Every step deeper into the woods, I kept thinking about the ring hidden in his backpack and the conversation I'd have to have with him. How do you tell someone you don't love them anymore right after they propose? The autumn forest was beautiful but unsettling, too quiet, like all the wildlife had fled. The trees were mostly bare, except for a few stubborn leaves clinging to branches, and they rustled without any wind. Marcus kept checking his phone for GPS signal, getting increasingly frustrated as the service cut in and out. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when we came to a fork that wasn't marked on any of our maps. The main trail continued uphill, but there was this smaller path that veered off into a little valley. "That's not supposed to be there," Marcus muttered, checking his phone again. "The trail description doesn't mention any side paths." Something about that unmarked trail called to me. Maybe I was subconsciously looking for any excuse to delay the inevitable, but I suggested we explore it. Marcus protested. He was worried about losing daylight for his planned proposal, but I was already heading down the narrow path. The descent was steep and the trail poorly maintained. Old blazes on trees were faded and hard to follow. As we went deeper into the valley, the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, and that unnatural silence got worse. No bird calls, no insects, even our footsteps seemed muffled. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the afternoon light. "This feels wrong," Marcus said behind me. "We should turn back." But I kept walking. There was something drawing me forward, like a fish on a line. The compulsion got stronger the deeper we went, until I felt like I had no choice but to keep following the path wherever it led. That's when we found Mirror Lake. It sat in a perfect circle at the bottom of the valley, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by tall pines that grew right to the water's edge. The lake wasn't on any of our maps. A body of water that size should have been marked, should have been a known destination. But there it was, hidden like a secret, its surface so still and black it looked like obsidian. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, "how is this not on the maps?" I walked to the water's edge, drawn by something I couldn't name. The reflection was perfect, too perfect. Every detail of the sky and trees mirrored exactly, but there was something underneath the reflection. Shadows moving in the depths, shapes that looked almost human but wrong somehow. Marcus started unpacking his camera equipment. "This is incredible. The photos are going to be amazing." But as soon as I got within 10 feet of the water, I felt this overwhelming compulsion to tell the truth. Not just be honest, be brutally, destructively honest about everything I'd been hiding. "I know about the gambling," I heard myself say. Marcus froze, camera halfway out of his bag. "What?" "The online poker. The debt. I've been checking your browser history for months." The words poured out of me like I was vomiting. I tried to stop talking, but couldn't. "You've lost over $20,000 in the past 6 months. That's why you've been so weird about money." His face went white. "Jess, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because I also know about the loan you took against your truck, and the credit cards you've maxed out, and the fact that the engagement ring you're planning to give me was bought with money you borrowed from your brother without telling him what it was for." Marcus sank down onto a fallen log, his hands shaking. "How could you possibly know all that?" "Because I hired a private investigator." The confession tore out of me like a scream. 3 weeks ago, I paid someone to investigate my own boyfriend because I knew you were lying about something but couldn't figure out what. "You what?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "I know about Sarah too." The color drained completely from his face. "Sarah? The woman from the casino, the one you've been texting, the one you met up with twice when you told me you were working late." I was crying now but couldn't stop the words. "I know you haven't slept with her yet, but you've been thinking about it, planning it." Marcus stood up slowly, and his reflection in the perfectly still water looked different from him. Older, meaner, with hollow, desperate eyes. That's not. I never meant for anything to happen with her. But it was going to, wasn't it, if I hadn't found out?" He nodded miserably. "I think so. Yeah, I think I was going to ruin everything with her because I'm too much of a coward to just end things with you." The honesty was like a drug. Painful but addictive. I couldn't stop myself from revealing more. "I've been sabotaging our relationship for months. Picking fights on purpose. Being cold and distant. Trying to make you break up with me because I was too scared to do it myself." "Why?" Marcus asked. "What are you so afraid of?" I looked at my reflection in the black water and saw something that made my blood freeze. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't smiling. My reflection looked satisfied, almost hungry, like it was feeding on our confessions. "Because I don't love you anymore," I said, and my reflection's smile got wider. "I haven't loved you for over a year. I've just been going through the motions because I was afraid of being alone." Marcus stared at me, then at his own reflection, which was doing something he wasn't doing. It was laughing. Silent, bitter laughter that didn't match his horrified expression. "The ring," he said slowly. "I bought the ring because I thought if we got engaged, you'd have to stay. Even if you wanted to leave, you'd feel obligated to try and make it work." "That's fucked up, Marcus." I know it is, but I was desperate. I could feel you pulling away and I didn't know how to fix it." His reflection was still laughing, even as tears streamed down his real face. "The gambling started because I was so anxious about losing you, and then it got out of control. And I knew if you found out you'd definitely leave, so I had to hide it, which made everything worse." The lake's surface began to ripple, even though there was no wind. In each ripple, I could see scenes from our relationship, but not the good memories. Only the lies, the manipulation, the gradual erosion of trust, Marcus lying about where he'd been, me going through his phone while he slept, both of us faking orgasms for months because we were too disconnected to enjoy sex. The time he came home drunk and called me a controlling bitch. The morning I realized I actively disliked him, but smiled and made coffee anyway. "It's showing us everything," Marcus whispered. "All the worst parts." But then the scenes in the water changed, showing things that hadn't happened yet. Marcus and me getting married, fighting viciously on our honeymoon. Me getting pregnant and knowing the baby wouldn't save us. Years of escalating cruelty, both of us becoming people we hated. A bitter divorce that destroyed us both financially and emotionally. Our future children traumatized by our toxic relationship. We would have destroyed each other, I said, understanding flooding through me. "Yeah," Marcus agreed, "but that's not the worst part." "What do you mean?" He pointed at the water, where new images were forming. "Look closer." I leaned over the lake's edge and saw scenes I didn't recognize. Marcus hitting me during an argument 3 years in the future. Me hiding bruises at work, both of us drinking heavily, Marcus progressing from gambling to harder addictions. Me having an affair with a patient at the dental office, someone vulnerable I manipulated. Escalating psychological abuse, financial control, systematic destruction of each other's self-worth. "This is who we become," Marcus said. "If we stay together, if we get married, this is our future." But as I stared into the dark water, I realized something worse was happening. The confessions weren't just revealing our relationship problems, they were changing us. Each truth we told made us harder, meaner. The guilt and shame were being eaten away, leaving only the raw selfishness underneath. "I'm glad your mother hates me," I heard myself say, and was horrified by the venom in my voice. "She's a bitter old woman, and I've been hoping she'd die so we could sell her house." Marcus's face twisted with rage. "Well, I'm glad your sister got cancer. I always thought she was prettier than you anyway, and now she looks like a skeleton." We both stopped, appalled by what we'd said. But the lake wasn't done with us. My reflection was no longer just smiling, it was transforming. Growing thinner, more angular, with sharp teeth and hollow eyes. Marcus's reflection was doing the same, becoming something predatory and cruel. "What's happening to us?" I whispered. That's when I heard the voice. Not out loud, but inside my head, like someone speaking directly to my brain. It sounded like my own voice, but colder. Hungrier. "Truth is hunger," it said. "Truth is power. Why pretend to be good when you can be honest about what you really are?" I looked at Marcus and saw his reflection climbing out of the water. Not Marcus, something wearing his face, but wrong. Too tall, joints bending the wrong way, fingers ending in claws. "Jess," Marcus said, but his voice sounded strange. Distant. "I can't stop talking. It won't let me stop." "I know," I said, watching my own reflection emerge from the lake. It looked like me, but perfected. Beautiful, in a terrible way, like a predator designed to hunt humans. "I think it wants us to say everything. Every horrible thing we've ever thought about each other. What if we don't want to?" My reflection tilted its head and smiled with too many teeth. "You don't have a choice," it said in my voice. That's when the real confession started. Marcus told me about the time he'd fantasized about pushing me down the stairs when I was nagging him about money. I told him about stealing cash from his wallet to pay for the private investigator. He admitted to putting sugar in my gas tank when I threatened to leave him, last spring. I confessed to telling his boss about his drinking problem, hoping to get him fired. With each revelation, our reflections grew stronger and we grew weaker, more transparent, like we were fading away while they became real. "It's taking us," Marcus said. His voice was barely audible now. "It's replacing us with the worst versions of ourselves." I tried to step away from the water, but my legs wouldn't move. My reflection was controlling me now, puppeting my body while my consciousness watched helplessly from somewhere deep inside my own skull. "I tried to poison you," my reflection said with my mouth. "Last month, when you had food poisoning, that was me. I put bleach in your coffee." "I've been recording you," Marcus's reflection replied. "For months. I have videos of you getting dressed, using the bathroom. I was planning to use them to blackmail you if you tried to leave me." These weren't true confessions, they were lies. But somehow, worse than lies. They were truths our reflections wanted to be true. The worst possible versions of ourselves, the people we could become if we fed every dark impulse and abandoned all moral restraint. I felt my humanity slipping away with each word. The love I'd once felt for Marcus, the guilt about wanting to leave him, the sadness about our failed relationship, all of it was being consumed, leaving only cruel satisfaction and predatory hunger. My reflection was almost completely solid now, while I was becoming a ghost. In a few more minutes, it would take over completely. I would still look like Jessica Chen, but inside I'd be something else. Something that fed on emotional pain and psychological destruction. "We have to get away from the water." I managed to whisper with what little control I had left, but our reflections were in control now. They walked us closer to the lake's edge, preparing to push our original selves into the water where we'd drown and they'd take our places permanently. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to say about mirrors and dark water, about how certain places could trap souls and twist them into hungry ghosts, about how the only way to break free was to reject the reflection entirely, to choose to be someone completely different from what it showed you. With the last of my strength, I forced my body to turn away from the lake. Not just my head, my entire body, so I couldn't see my reflection anymore. The moment I broke eye contact with my reflection, I felt a snap like a rubber band breaking. Suddenly I could move again, think clearly again. The compulsion to confess disappeared. "Marcus," I shouted, "don't look at the water, turn around." He was almost at the water's edge, his reflection reaching out to pull him in. But he heard me and somehow managed to spin around, putting his back to the lake. The screaming started immediately. Not humans screaming, something else, something furious and hungry, and thwarted. Our reflections, trapped in the water, shrieking at being denied their prey. "Run," I gasped, grabbing Marcus's hand. "Run now." We ran. Through the darkening forest, up the steep trail, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, the screaming got louder, more desperate. I could hear splashing, like something large thrashing in the water. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail. Even then, we kept moving fast, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and that cursed lake. By the time we reached the car, it was full dark, and we were both sobbing with terror and exhaustion. Marcus's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. "What the hell was that place?" "I don't know," I said. "But we can never go back. We can never tell anyone about it. The things we said to each other, those weren't us. Not really. That place, it was feeding on our relationship problems, making them worse, turning them into something evil." We drove back to Asheville in silence, both of us processing what had happened. The weird thing was, even though we'd said terrible things to each other by the lake, I didn't feel angry or hurt. Those confessions hadn't been real, they'd been poison, forced out of us by something that fed on human misery. What was real was the underlying truth. Our relationship was broken, had been broken for a long time, and we'd both been too scared to admit it. 3 days later, we had a real conversation. Honest but kind. We talked about what had gone wrong, what we'd learned about ourselves, how we could do better with other people. We ended things mutually, with genuine care for each other's well-being. Marcus got help for his gambling addiction. I stopped trying to control and fix other people's problems. We both entered therapy to work on the patterns that had made us toxic together. I never went hiking alone again, and I made Marcus promise to stay away from remote mountain lakes, especially ones that weren't on any maps. He's married now, to someone who fits his life much better than I ever did. They're happy, as far as I can tell. I'm dating someone too, a teacher named David, who's honest about his struggles and doesn't try to hide from difficult conversations. But sometimes, on particularly dark November nights, I dream about that lake. In my dreams, I look into the black water and see my reflection smiling back at me with too many teeth. In my dreams, I never looked away. I let that thing take my place, and now I'm the reflection, trapped forever in cold, dark water, waiting for the next couple to find me so I can feed on their secrets. I wake up from those dreams, checking mirrors compulsively, making sure my reflection is doing exactly what I'm doing. Because the worst part about Mirror Lake isn't that it shows you the truth about yourself. It's that sometimes, late at night when I'm brushing my teeth or washing my face, I catch my reflection moving just a split second after I do. And when that happens, I see it smile with too many teeth before snapping back into perfect synchronization. I think part of me is still there, in that lake. Part of me will always be there, waiting in the dark water for the next truth that needs to be told. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find myself craving that brutal honesty again, missing the way it felt to say exactly what I was thinking with no filter, no kindness, no consideration for anyone else's feelings. That's how I know Mirror Lake is still feeding. It just uses different bait now. I'm 29 years old, and I haven't been able to listen to music the same way since November 2023. I teach middle school band in Charleston, West Virginia, and my girlfriend Jordan works as a sound engineer for a local studio. We'd been together 3 years, and music was everything to us. We met in college playing in this terrible indie band that thought we were going to change the world. Looking back now, I wish we'd never been so obsessed with perfect sound. The anniversary trip to Monongahela National Forest was supposed to be romantic, but we're both practical people. Jordan had this idea that we could record some natural soundscapes while we were up there, maybe use them for this ambient album we'd been planning. She'd been talking for months about how the acoustics in those mountains were supposed to be incredible, something about the way sound travels through the hollows that you can't replicate in a studio. I was excited about it because teaching middle schoolers all day, you forget what real music sounds like. You need to get away from squeaky clarinets and off-key recorders, and remember why you fell in love with sound in the first place. We picked November because the campgrounds would be mostly empty. Tourist season was over, hunting season hadn't really started yet, and Jordan said you get the purest natural sound when there aren't any other people around. No car engines, no generators humming from RVs, no kids screaming, just the forest being itself. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, found this little spot near Seneca Creek, about 2 miles off the main trail. There was this natural depression in the landscape, surrounded by rock formations that created what Jordan called a perfect natural amphitheater. When she clapped her hands, you could hear it echo for almost 4 seconds. "This is it," she said, setting down her equipment cases. "This is exactly what I've been looking for." Jordan had brought her good stuff, a pair of Neumann condenser mics that cost more than my car, a Zoom F8N recorder that could capture frequencies most people can't even hear, the whole professional setup. We spent Friday evening just recording ambient sound. Wind through the trees, water running over rocks in the creek, some owls calling back and forth across the valley. Even caught what we thought might be a fox yipping somewhere up the ridge. When we played it back through Jordan's studio headphones, it was beautiful, pure, exactly what we'd hoped for. That first night, we sat by the fire and talked about layering our own music over the natural recordings. Jordan had this vision of acoustic guitar and vocals that would harmonize with what the forest was already doing, create something that felt both human and wild. So I got out my Martin and we started playing around with some simple folk melodies, singing together like we used to do in college. Our voices carried really well in that little clearing, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were making real music again. It wasn't until Jordan started analyzing the recordings on her laptop that we noticed something strange. She's got this software called Spectra Layers that breaks down audio into visual waveforms, shows you all the different frequencies and harmonic layers. While we were listening to playback from our evening session, she suddenly stopped and frowned at the screen. "Alex, look at this," she said, adjusting her headphones. "There's this subsonic pattern running through the entire recording, way below human hearing range, but it's definitely there." I leaned over to look at her laptop screen. In the frequency analysis, there were these regular pulses in the bass range, too structured and rhythmic to be natural wind or water noise. They looked almost mathematical, like someone had programmed a pattern into frequencies so low that only machines could detect them. Equipment interference? I suggested, but Jordan was already shaking her head. No, look at the timing. The pattern only appears when we were singing. When it's just ambient forest sound, it's completely clean. We listened to the whole 2-hour session, and she was right. Those strange subsonic frequencies appeared every single time our voices were audible on the recording. Not only that, but they seemed to respond to specific notes and chord progressions. When we hit certain harmonies, the pulses would change rhythm and intensity, almost like something was trying to harmonize along with us. Maybe it's resonance from the rock formations, I said, but even as I said it, I knew it sounded weak. This was too deliberate, too responsive. Jordan played back one section where we'd been singing a simple 2-part harmony. Right there on the visual display, you could see the subsonic frequencies adjusting to match our intervals, creating complex harmonic relationships that shouldn't have been possible from natural acoustics. "We need to test this," she said. Saturday morning, she set up the mics again and we sang the same song, this time watching the frequency analysis in real time. The moment we started harmonizing, those low-frequency patterns appeared again, pulsing in rhythm with our music, but adding layers we couldn't hear. It was like something invisible was singing along with us, harmonizing in frequencies below human perception. "Jordan, this is impossible," I said, checking her equipment connections for the 3rd time. "The mics aren't picking up any source for these frequencies. They're just appearing in the digital signal." That's when we realized the forest had gone completely silent, not gradually quiet. I mean dead silent between one breath and the next. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. Jordan and I looked at each other, and I could see the same thought in her eyes that was forming in mine. Something was listening to us. "Maybe we should head back," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I was whispering, but Jordan was staring at her equipment displays. The meters were showing impossible readings, audio levels, and frequency responses that shouldn't exist without a sound source. We weren't making any noise, weren't even breathing hard, but the recorder was picking up layers and layers of subsonic activity, all centered around the same frequency ranges we'd been hearing in our recordings. That's when the vibration started. Not something we heard, something we felt in our bones. This deep, thrumming pulse that seemed to rise up through the ground and settle in our chests like a second heartbeat. I've been to concerts where the bass is so loud you feel it in your ribcage, but this was different. This was coming from everywhere at once, and it was getting stronger. "Jordan, we need to leave. Right now." But she was transfixed by her laptop screen. The frequency analysis was showing patterns that looked almost like sheet music, complex harmonic progressions that were shifting and evolving in real time. "Alex, I think something is trying to communicate with us." The vibration intensified, and suddenly I could feel it in my teeth, behind my eyes, in the spaces between my thoughts. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was physical force, pressing against us from all directions. The air in the clearing started to shimmer and distort, like heat waves rising off summer asphalt, and I realized with growing horror that we could see the sound waves themselves, visible ripples in the atmosphere that pulsed in rhythm with the subsonic thrumming. That's when I understood we weren't dealing with some acoustic phenomenon. This was alive, and it was studying us. The entity, because that's the only word that fits, began to change frequency, and the change was agony. The harmonic vibrations that had been merely uncomfortable turned sharp and discordant, like every bone in my body was being used as a tuning fork for sounds that shouldn't exist. Jordan dropped her headphones and covered her ears, but it didn't help. The sound was coming from inside the air around us, inside us. I grabbed my guitar and tried to play something, anything, to harmonize with the frequency instead of fighting against it. But every chord I attempted made it worse. The entity seemed to take my musical attempts and twist them, turn them into something wrong and painful. It was learning our language, the language of music, and using it against us. Jordan started humming frantically, trying different note combinations, but the entity absorbed each attempt and reflected it back as discord. We were trapped in a feedback loop of our own making, every musical phrase we produced being corrupted and returned to us as harmonic torture. That's when I realized what was happening. This thing didn't just live in sound, it was sound. Some kind of acoustic intelligence that had existed in these mountains for who knows how long. and we'd disturbed it with our recording equipment. We'd taught it our musical patterns, and now it was using that knowledge to hurt us. The visible sound waves in the air began to form shapes, geometric patterns that hurt to look at. I could feel my inner ears starting to bleed from the pressure, and Jordan was on her knees, her hands pressed against her head. The entity wasn't just communicating, it was experimenting, using us as test subjects to understand how human hearing worked, how much acoustic pressure our bodies could take before breaking. Stop. I tried to shout, but my voice came out wrong, harmonized with frequencies that made the words incomprehensible. The entity absorbed my plea and echoed it back as a grotesque chorus of my own voice, layered and distorted until it sounded like 100 versions of me screaming in unison. Jordan's equipment started to smoke. The digital recorder was trying to process audio levels that exceeded its design limits, and the laptop's speakers were crackling with sounds they couldn't reproduce. But the entity kept learning, kept evolving its acoustic attacks based on how we responded to each frequency assault. I don't know how long it lasted. Time seemed to stretch and compress with each wave of sound, but eventually, something changed. Maybe we'd reached the limit of what the entity could learn from us. Or maybe it had simply grown bored with our suffering. The acoustic assault began to fade. The visible distortions in the air slowly dissipated, and normal forest sounds gradually returned. We packed our gear in complete silence and hiked back to the truck without speaking a word. Jordan's equipment was fried. Thousands of dollars worth of professional audio gear reduced to useless electronic scrap. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what it did to our hearing. At first, we thought we'd just suffered temporary hearing damage from the acoustic assault. But over the following weeks, we realized the entity had left us with something much stranger and more disturbing. Our hearing hadn't been damaged. It had been changed, enhanced in ways that make normal life almost unbearable. I can hear the mathematical relationships between sounds now, but not in any musical or beautiful way. I hear the discord in everything, the slight pitch variations in people's voices that reveal when they're lying, the harmonic distortions in electronic devices that signal when they're about to fail, the subsonic frequencies that accompany human illness and emotional distress. Every sound is layered with information I never wanted to have. Jordan quit her job at the studio. She says she can hear the suffering embedded in recorded music now. The acoustic fingerprints of every argument, every moment of pain, every instance of loneliness that was happening in the room when the songs were recorded. Music, which used to be our shared passion, has become a catalog of human misery that we can't turn off. Worse, we hear them sometimes. Other entities like the one we encountered. Living sounds that exist in the spaces between normal audio frequencies, acoustic intelligences that most people never notice because they lack the enhanced hearing to detect them. They're everywhere, in cities, in buildings, in the electronic hum of modern life, and they've noticed that we can hear them now. Jordan and I broke up 3 months after the trip, not because we stopped loving each other, but because when we're together, our enhanced hearing creates a resonance effect that attracts them. They gather around us when we're in the same room, drawn by whatever acoustic signature the mountain entity left in our nervous systems. We can feel them studying us, learning from us, preparing for something we don't understand. I still teach middle school band, but it's torture now. I can hear the emotional pain in every off-key note, the family trauma embedded in how each kid approaches their instrument, the future heartbreak and disappointment that their young voices already carry. The children think I'm getting better at my job because I can predict exactly when someone's about to break down crying or lose their temper. They don't realize I'm just hearing the acoustic warning signs of human emotional collapse. I've tried noise-canceling headphones, white noise machines, even considered surgical options to damage my hearing back to normal levels. Nothing works. The changes the entity made go deeper than physical ear damage. They're neurological, maybe even something worse than that. Sometimes, late at night, I get calls on my cell phone. When I answer, there's no voice on the other end. Just subsonic patterns that I can now understand are communications from the mountain entity. It's still learning from us, still studying the acoustic signatures it planted in our minds. And I think it's teaching what it learned to others. Jordan called me last week. She'd been hiking alone in a different part of Appalachia, trying to find some peace in the mountains. She found another one. a different acoustic entity that had learned our musical language from communications with the first one. It knew her name. It sang to her in harmonics that were specifically designed to cause psychological pain in humans with enhanced hearing. They're spreading, learning from each other. And we taught them how. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I don't go anywhere. There might be natural acoustics that could hide something like what we found. But I'm starting to think it doesn't matter where I go. They're in the cities now too, hiding in the electrical hum and traffic noise and construction sounds. Every day, I hear more of them, and they hear me. The entity in Monongahela didn't want to hurt us initially. It was just curious. But curiosity from something that exists as living sound, that experiences reality, as pure acoustic information, means something very different from human curiosity. We were specimens, test subjects. And the experiments aren't over. I keep Jordan's ruined recording equipment in my closet. Sometimes when I'm feeling particularly masochistic, I'll try to turn it on. The devices are completely dead, but I can still hear what the entity left embedded in their circuits. Subsonic messages that seem to be coordinates, locations where others like it can be found. A growing network of acoustic intelligences that are learning to cooperate, to share information about human weaknesses and how our hearing can be weaponized against us. Last month, I started hearing children's voices in the static between radio stations. Not actual children, acoustic mimicry based on vocal patterns the entities have observed and analyzed. They're practicing human speech, learning to replicate the sounds that mean the most to us, so they can use those sounds to hurt us more effectively. The thing about sound is that you can't unsee it once you understand what it really is. Every noise around you right now, the hum of your devices, the traffic outside, the settling of your building, could be hiding something that's listening, learning, preparing. And if you've ever made music in a place where the acoustics seemed too perfect, where your voice carried just a little too well, there's a chance you've already taught them something they can use against others. I still have Jordan's frequency analysis from that weekend. The visual patterns the entity created, the mathematical progressions it used to communicate. I've never shown them to anyone because I'm afraid of what might happen if another acoustic intelligence saw them. But I look at them sometimes, trying to understand what it was telling us. I think it was saying thank you for the music lessons, for teaching it how human hearing works, how to turn the thing we love most into a weapon against us. And I think it was saying goodbye, because it doesn't need us anymore.